Yay! Less small talk. Amazing.
How are you?
Hi, Mike. I'm great. How are you?
Good to join you again. I really enjoyed the last conversation we had.
Oh my gosh, so did we. One of our favorites for sure. Thanks for finding time and joining us for this discussion. So I mean, our last discussion that we had was more of like an office hours. We just chatted about legislation that we all care about, values that the Green Party holds, etc. But this one is more about sussing out who you are as a person and why are you fit to lead the province and help us do this sort of recovery of not just the pandemic, but like the Ford era. So I guess what we could maybe do to get started is on our team, we talk about what our superpowers are a lot as individuals. Like, what are the things that we're uniquely talented at? And like, what are the things that we play to our advantage? And what are the things that we're not as great at that we should find community members and organizations to help us achieve those things? So from your perspective, what are the Green Party's superpowers, and what would be sort of the things that you would need to like find people to collaborate and learn from and so forth?
Yeah, well, I think one of our superpowers is to, even though we're small, I think we have an outsized influence, and I think that really comes from a commitment to what I call people-powered politics. That it's really engaging, mobilizing, empowering, giving voice, and speaking out on issues that maybe others aren't as willing to speak out on. And in particular for me, in the current campaign we're in, is addressing the climate emergency and also addressing poverty, and which I just made a major announcement on this morning, or we've gone live here. And then things we could work on. I mean, there's so much more we need to learn about just, how to be a more effective organization. We're the fourth party. We're the smallest party. We're still learning, I don't know how to better get our message out, how to break through. I know I was listening to one podcast yesterday saying, Mike Schreiner's got to break through on climate. And I'm thinking, man, I'm talking about climate almost every day in this campaign right now. And so I think one of the things we'll have to figure out is like, how do we break through and really make sure our message is heard by a mainstream audience?
No, I think like every time I look into the Green Party, I'm like, oh my God, this is what my heart's screaming about. Like, this is what I really feel is what we need to do. But for whatever reason, these other parties have like such a hold on having done it for so long that it just doesn't. Yeah. So I guess one of the things I want to talk about this, but I also want to get through the questions that we had because they were really good ones. But I really want to get to ODSP. Because that's something I've been paying a lot of attention to. So actually, let's just go there. Let's just start there.
Sure.
So can you tell us what it is and why for it looks like Ontario and all the other parties running are just okay with letting people live below the poverty line? And that just seems messed up.
Yeah, it's totally messed up. Like, thanks for talking about it, because I literally just did an announcement on it this morning, and it's something near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of volunteer work at anti-poverty organizations in my community here in Guelph, and particularly serving meals to people who are oftentimes unhoused or really just struggling to figure out a way to put food on the table. And I don't know, a lot of people don't realize this, but Ontario Disability Support Payment, so that's for people with disabilities who are unable to work, essentially. They receive $1,100 a month to live on. Like, can you imagine? Like, where can you even find an apartment for $1,100 a month, let alone like pay your bills and put food on the table? And I've like live a life, like, and then for somebody on Ontario Works, it's even harder. It's $731 a month. It's just like crushing legislated poverty. And I think Ontario's better than this. Like, I really think across the political spectrum, I think we have a more caring society than forcing people to live in legislative poverty. And I just don't think enough people know how hard and soul crushing it is. And so we've made a real priority issue in this election to immediately double social assistance rates, which at the very least would bring up people with disabilities up to the low income cutoff level. I mean, we determined under the pandemic that people should get $2,000 a month to survive. So, I think people with disabilities should be able to, have 2,000, like slightly over in our case, $2,000 a month to be able to survive. And even that's not a lot of money. So we're not
Mm-mm.
tons of money here, but at least like moving people out of forcing them into poverty and just, and the costs associated with that. One study says $33 billion it costs Ontario and additional healthcare costs, criminal justice costs, lost productivity. But I think more importantly, just the quality of life for people who are forced into such deep poverty. And so I don't know how many of your listeners remember the Mike Harris government, but back in the mid 1990s, he was the last. It was the last conservative government that came into office, and one of the first things they did was cut social assistance rates by 22%, like literally overnight. It was unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it. It was like literally like one day people were making this, getting this amount a month, and the next month they're just like 22% less. It was awful. There were huge protests. I remember going to Queen's Park and being part of some of those protests when I was in my probably mid 20s at that point. And so believe it or not, the rates that the Liberals, the NDP, and Conservatives are proposing for social assistance rates would actually be less inflation adjusted than what Mike Harris, than what the Harris government was providing people. So it just shows you the rates have been frozen for so long. And just think about the inflation we're experiencing and, how much housing has gone up, food has gone up, utility bills have gone up, like everything's gone up. And so people are being forced into deeper and deeper poverty. And so what we're saying is, what, let's bring in a wealth tax on, people with wealth of over $10 million. I think they can spare a little bit. We're not asking for too much, a little bit, so that we can bring people out of legislated poverty. And I think it's just the right thing to do. And so it's something we've made a central part of our campaign in this election. And, we're getting some movement. Doug Ford government put out a budget, less than a month ago, and there was no social assistance rates in the budget. And even Mr. Ford now has said, we'll raise them 5%, which is still incredibly insufficient. But hey,
Right.
starting to make some progress. And so, I just keep saying to people across the province, keep speaking out, because I know we're a caring province, and nobody should have to live in that kind of poverty.
Yeah, I also think it's just like what it really comes down to is like, if like, are you saying people should have less than, like, not you, but we're just okay with people getting less than a livable income? Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. I think about this a lot, about how like wealthy Canada is. Like, I have relatives in Sri Lanka, and they struggle there because of the way that country is set up and colonization and blah blah blah.
Yep.
But I think about Canada and how rich we are in resources, wealth, ideas, and a democracy, and then to see us fail over and over again in supporting our most vulnerable, and our most marginalized, is such a, like, I don't know, like, it's just so fucked up. Like, it's just really not okay. And I think we just have to stop thinking about like, where will we find the money for this? Because there's like people buying Twitter for like it's fine. We'll just get a wealth tax and we'll solve some of these problems. I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that. But
Yeah, I hear you on that one. And I could just tell you so many heart-wrenching stories of people who, one woman I spoke to recently, she actually had reached out to me because she wanted to get some additional support for her son with autism. And in the course of the conversation, she was like, I've lost my job because I have a chronic illness and a disability. And I loved the work I was doing. She's like, I feel like I was making such a difference in my community, but because of my chronic illness, I can't do it anymore. And now I'm on ODSP, and like our family's just losing everything. Like, we're just literally losing everything. And she's like, I feel so horrible having to take my kids to the food bank to, get a little bit of, to put food on the table. I don't have any extras whatsoever. to provide them with things that other kids have. And it's just, and I've had those types of conversations just over and over with so many people. And it's like, let's just do the right thing and help people. And so I get really frustrated when somebody like Doug Ford says, get a job. I can't tell you how many people with disabilities I've talked to are like, I had a job. I loved my work. I was in a traffic crash, and in seconds, my life was turned upside down, and I lost my job, and I can't get a job now, or I've got a chronic illness, or I have a severe mental health challenge I'm working through, and so many folks are like, I want a job, like I really want a job, but a job isn't accessible for me. There's
Mm-hmm.
no, like, there aren't accommodations for me. My body won't allow me to do the work. And if we could just provide people with the supports to stabilize their lives, so many folks I know with disabilities make incredible contributions to our society, our communities, in a whole variety of ways. And to then say, oh, you have to live in legislative poverty, is just wrong.
No, I totally agree. I want to take us back to some of the other questions we had
Sure.
because one of the things that I'm constantly trying to unpack with our team, and we try to think about it a lot, is the fact that this whole system that we have is like within a colonial framework, right? And we know that this framework, that like colonization, is rooted in white supremacy. So the system and the way that it's set up wasn't really set up to support people who weren't like wealthy white men that were landowners, and it feels like we gave people more access to vote without like addressing all the systemic issues that would continue even though you would have access, like the ability to vote. So as someone who's white and leading a party and working within a colonial framework, how do you work on yourself and like for your party and the people in your team to like dismantle that white supremacy as you continue to work within this framework?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things for me is just to really acknowledge. I mean, I'm a white middle class cisgendered, middle aged man. Like I'm probably the most privileged part of a category of people or group of people, the most privileged people who ever walked on the earth. And so, first of all, I think it's acknowledging that and
Mm-hmm.
understanding that and having conversations to learn about the implications around that privilege, and then then what do you do with it, right? Like, and how do you try to make a difference to dismantle those systems of oppression, colonialism, anti-Black racism that are so embedded in our society, and so some of that is just working on my own learning, listening, learning, acting on that, and a lot of it comes from also making sure that I step back and create space for other voices,
Mm-hmm.
or marginalized voices, to be empowered, to make decisions, to have a voice, to make sure that my voice doesn't drown out those voices, if that makes sense. And so we've really worked hard as a party to make sure our candidates reflect the diversity of the province, that our platform development process had a number of women, people of color, Indigenous folks at the table, designing our platform and really taking the lead and
Mm-hmm.
sort of saying, hey, I give up control over this process and you lead it, and I'll step back because I have a lot of power, and I want to make sure I don't exercise it in inappropriate and irresponsible ways that drown out other people's ability to be empowered. And so I think it's a constant process of learning. But I also think for me, it's speaking out too when it's appropriate. I think sometimes, particularly, a middle-aged white man, when you see acts of white supremacy happening or you see hateful acts taking place, to denounce it and to really speak out and show allyship and solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
with people who are experiencing and are being targeted by that hate, because you can't put all the burden of that on the people who are being targeted. And so it's constantly trying to figure out where that balance is, where I step back and really give other people the space to lead, and where it's appropriate for me to step out and speak out because it might be a little safer and easier for me in certain situations to do it, but to always make sure it's done in a constant process of negotiation and I don't know if co-creation is the right word, but just like doing it together. If that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I think it does. You talked about a little bit about unlearning and continuing to learn. Over the last, maybe let's say like 2 years, what's something that you had to unlearn? Um,
Uh,
and now how do you use that in like the work you've done going forward? Like how has that changed your decision making?
yeah, maybe I can give you two. I'll start with one that's like really near and dear to why I got into politics. Is my children will tell you this too. I have two daughters, and I used to give a lot of speeches that I'm fighting for my children's future, and I have a responsibility to make sure we address the climate emergency so they have a livable future. And I'm increasingly realizing that it's actually young people leading the fight for that livable future. And I'm along for the ride. And I'm just trying to use my privilege as an elected official um, to amplify those voices, empower those voices, take those voices and energy into places where decisions are being made. But it's really, I think really when it comes to the climate movement, especially it's young people leading. I don't want to put it all on Greta Thunberg because it's a whole number of young people, but just to think the power of at the time a 18-year-old high school student just having the courage to stand in front of the Parliament buildings every Friday on a climate strike, and to have that ignite and spark a global climate movement, and to have somebody that young be such a powerful voice for change is pretty inspiring, and is very humbling for somebody like myself who's like in an elected position and will likely never have that big of a voice, right? It just shows you how powerful youth-led social movements are, and so that's one for me. And I think the other one, in terms of the pandemic, um, has reinforced. I don't think it would maybe a new learning, but it's reinforced for me um, just how the structures of our society lead to disproportionately negative outcomes for the most vulnerable in our communities. And I think you've seen that in the pandemic response. Who was most affected negatively and impacted by the pandemic were, oftentimes lower income workers, racialized workers, neighborhoods and communities that tend to be predominantly people of color. And so I guess for me, I knew that existed in society, but the pandemic really shined a bright light on that. And I think just
Hmm.
undeniable that these severe cracks in the foundations, particularly of our systems of care, have to be fixed.
Um, those are really interesting. I'm going to push further with some of
Sure.
the things that the last 2 years showed me. So the last two years definitely showed how social inequities, um, like the social inequities in our country, in our province, how deep they run, how they disproportionately affect people who have been systemically oppressed and marginalized. But also the last 2 years brought attention to issues that for so long Ontario and Canada just pretended wasn't a thing. We saw George Floyd get murdered, and because the pandemic, that like fortunately was nothing new. But because the pandemic created a standstill, like feeling, you had to like stop and watch and feel. And then as a country, we're coming up into the 1 year anniversary of recovering 215 bodies of children. It's something that this country, like the treatment of Indigenous people in this country, continues to be like abysmal, like just fucked, right? And about a year ago, also coming up to a year, there was a terrorist attack in London, Ontario, where a Muslim family was killed for just walking down the street. And I look at all of this and I think about what my position is in all of that. I'm a Hindu, South Asian woman, middle class. I wouldn't say upper middle class. Parents are immigrants, refugees, and I feel called to action. I feel like it's my duty to show up and bring it to the front of everyone's mind, these issues, and that's what our content does. But I feel like a lot of these big issues are not being talked about on the political stage, when it's such an opportunity to center the hate and division in this country and talk about combating all of that systemically. So if you were elected, and even if you aren't, what is your role here?
Yeah, so can I unpack it a little bit more, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
And I give credit to a constituent of mine who is a Black woman who reached out to my office and just said, it was after some of the COVID measures were lifted in Ontario. And she said to me, she's like, I'm not opposed to the fact that some of the mandates around vaccines and masks and things like that were lifted. She's like, I'm actually good with that in her case. Not everyone agrees with that, but in her case. But she said, what really angers me is that, when George Floyd was murdered, and the Black Lives Matter marches, protests were happening all across the world and all across our country and in our community. She's like, I haven't seen much change at all. And she's like, a group occupies Ottawa, and a few weeks later, everybody across the country, governments across the country are like, okay, we'll get rid of the mandates, we'll get rid of it. And it was just almost an instant response. And she's like, how does that make me feel as a vulnerable Black woman? And I'm like, you're right. It's so true. And so I think for me, I think politicians have to start backing up words with legislative action. And I really want to give a shout out to the fantastic work that the National Council of Canadian Muslims have done in putting forward legislative recommendations for what would be called the Our London Family Act, in commemorating the horrific and just hateful terrorist attack against the Absalom family in London. And one of my deepest disappointments at Queen's Park this spring was that that act did not pass. And my hope is, and I'm going to continue to work really hard, especially if I'm reelected, to try to get all parties in the legislature to come together and support that act, because I think it would make such a powerful statement to the Muslim community in particular, but to our entire province, that there be, I hope, a unanimous vote to pass that act, so we take our words of condemnation and we move it into legislative action against hate. And I'll give credit. The act was officially submitted to the legislature by a member of the NDP party. And so let's give credit where credit is due on that. And my hope is, and I think one of my skills at Queen's Park is, I can be highly critical of the government, and I can be passionately partisan about the issues that are near and dear to my heart. But I've also feel like I have an ability to try to bring people together. I actually co-sponsored or spearheaded the first bill in Ontario history that all four parties sponsored, declaring the month of August Emancipation Month, which I think is a great opportunity to, one, educate Canadians about the fact that we had slavery in Canada and in the British Empire, and that the legacy through systemic racism of that history still exists in Canada. So I know it's a symbolic act, but still I think an important one. And my hope is that we can come together and have all party support for the Our London Family Act, because I think words only get you so far, and they have to be backed up with legislative action, and we have an opportunity here to back words up with legislative action.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate that, and I recognize like that there are like if the other party leaders respond to our invitation, these are the same questions I would be asking them. But I struggle with like these like symbolic gestures quite a bit. Like great. I mean, I'll name that I'm not Black, so like perhaps that does have like quite a weight for the Black community to have Emancipation Day a month be declared. But and like I do think it's important, but where does that act then include like we're going to change our education system to like is that in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so this is exactly why we need to pass legislation like the Our London Family Act that actually puts in legislative measures around combating hate and increasing fines for hate crimes and things like that. And so I agree with you. Something like the Emancipation Month Act is mostly symbolic, and symbols only get so far. I will say I did have members from the Black community come to me and ask me if I would spearhead the Emancipation Act month, because for at least this group and this segment, and I certainly, every community is very diverse, so there'll be lots of different opinions. It was important to have all four parties support that and to make an important statement. But I absolutely agree with you that symbolic acts are a step in the right direction, but wholly insufficient. And that's why we need, there's a bill before the legislature, for example, and we have this in our platform as well, around requiring, anti-Black racism be part of our education curriculum. Have to fund an Indigenous curriculum program so we incorporate Indigenous issues and issues around colonialism in our curriculum. We need legislative acts that change the laws and penalties around acts of hate. And those are things that I'm working on, will continue to work on. And that's what I mean when I say we have to back up words and symbols with action.
Yeah, I think we're aligned on that because I think that it does feel like a bit of a pat ourselves on the back in this like colonial white space to be like, yay, we now have announced that, in 2020, I don't know when you passed this, but
Yeah.
whenever it was passed, that like Emancipation Month, we care about like slavery was a thing in this country, but it just doesn't feel like enough, and it's hard to see what the world is combating right now, and like to see what happened in Ottawa and not see meaningful action as opposed to like performative action from our leaders. Like Doug Ford went to London, Ontario after that family was killed, murdered. And like I feel so confused about why isn't that something that we take action on right away? Like it's like an opportunity, and it's people's lives are like hanging in this, and it feels like this is part of the reason why I think younger people feel frustrated with the system of politics, right? Like, and maybe because it feels like our leaders say one thing but don't do it, and it's hard to take that seriously and put faith in a system. But I will say that like I do appreciate what you're saying here, and I guess most of my anger is towards Doug Ford right now.
But don't, I totally agree with you on that, but, don't hesitate to get angry at all politicians. I say to people all the time, a lot of people say to me, oh, Mike, I know you're with us on this issue, so I'm going to write Doug Ford. And I'm like, write me too, because you got to hold every politician accountable. And even the ones who you may think are aligned or agree with you, it's like you got to light a fire, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to always speak out. I think one of the things on this topic, one of the things I'm really pushing right now that's in our platform, in our mental health strategy, is to understand the intersection between race and mental health in particular, and how many uh, crisis calls when people are experiencing a mental health crisis, which really should be a public health issue, are directed to police. And
Mm-hmm.
then the police response, and the police themselves will oftentimes tell you we're not equipped or trained or the appropriate people to respond, but because nobody else is there to respond, that's who responds. And how many, a disproportionate number of those outcomes are violent and negative for somebody in crisis or distress. And so one of the things we're really pushing right now is to set up a 3-digit number that would not be 911, completely separate number that people could call when they're experiencing a crisis, and there would be a mental health and a public health response, and not a police response. And so to me, that's one of many actions that I think politicians can take and have the ability to take if we're willing to make those changes, to start reimagining what community well-being looks like, and you know, and redefining what community safety, community well-being, and public health is. And so I think there are a number of different kinds of legislative and systemic changes that we can make. Um, we just have to have the political courage, ability, will to make them.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. And I guess speaking on like political courage and having politicians be held accountable. So my member of provincial parliament right now, or before the election was called, was Paul Calandra. I know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm super lucky. And I've emailed him thousands of times, never heard back. I've never been left on red so much. It's like a disaster feeling. So my like utmost goal is to not have him as my elected representative. Like I'm in the neighborhood group chat being like, yo, we cannot do this again. We've got to vote for someone else. And the big thing that comes out from that is, but who? In this riding, do I vote with my heart or do I vote with my head and vote strategically to ensure that I am not putting Doug Ford back into the like world again? And that's where I struggle with the most, because this first past the post bullshit sucks so much.
Yep.
What are we supposed to do when it comes to vote? Like if the goal is I just don't want him to get back into office again, what are my options here?
Yeah. You know what's so soul crushing about that? And for me, especially when it comes to issues around alleviating poverty, issues around racial justice and climate justice, is that the system is almost systemically preventing the action that we need.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say I'm not going to tell you how to make that decision for yourself, because obviously you're the one who has to decide for yourself. And I'm in the middle of an election, and I would obviously encourage you to vote Green. And so I just don't want to go there for the format of this conversation. I don't want it to be that partisan.
Sure.
But I would say that we absolutely have to change our voting system.
Yeah.
So our parliament reflects the democratic will of the people of this province, so that we every vote counts. I mean, one of the things I struggle with is from a climate perspective is I feel like we're in a climate emergency. It's like now or never. Literally, the International Panel on Climate Change just said it's like now or never.
Right.
And you're thinking like, I'm running as leader of the Green Party because I want like bold, ambitious, doable, aggressive climate action. And, Doug Ford has taken us backwards and has dismantled, almost every climate initiative in the province, is systematically dismantling environmental protections. And so, yeah, like we got to get rid of Doug Ford. Then I look at the climate plans from the Liberals and the NDP, and they're certainly better than the Conservatives, no doubt about it. But they don't meet the moment with the ambition we need. And so then I'm like torn. Like, what do I do? Because, like, I, as a Green, it's like, and as somebody who understands the climate science, I'm like, we half measures won't get us there. And so we need a political system that creates the space for us to meet this moment where it doesn't have to be the really bad choice or the choice that kind of moves us in the right direction but doesn't get us as far as we need to go. And that could be that exists on a whole variety of issues. I mean, we just talked about ODSP earlier today as another example. You could give a whole long list. And so, changing the voting system, I think, is going to be vital to that. And it's something I know the Ontario Greens are committed to. I know the NDP is committed to that. And my hope is that our two parties will have some leverage after this election to make that happen. And I don't know, you probably don't have a lot of Conservatives as part of your audience, but I would say to Conservatives, you have an interest in this too. Conservatives got the most votes in the last federal election, and we have a Liberal government. And so in that particular case, the election, didn't reflect the democratic will of a number of Conservatives who voted. And so they should be upset too. Like, we should all be upset that we have this election, regardless of your partisan stripes or where you fit on the ideological spectrum. We have an electoral system that oftentimes gives somebody with 35% of the vote 100% of the power. And that's just wrong. Like, absolutely no sense whatsoever. And if you look at some of the best governed countries around the world, particularly those that address climate and social justice, most of them have proportional representation. And so that's what we need in Canada. I would encourage any of your listeners who are concerned about this issue to get involved in an organization like Fair Vote Canada that's really doing a lot of activist work around fixing our voting system so we have a better real democracy.
That's awesome. Thank you. And then my last question before I just sort of give you the mic for a couple seconds and to say whatever you want to say is, so we have a supply and confidence deal between, like, in the federal government. So, like, I'll be honest, I was like, I thought it was like coalition or nothing, like I didn't know that there were these other levels. But then it made me think, like, we're in a provincial election. We all like the one thing all the other parties except for the Conservatives have is like a deep, like, no more Ford. We cannot do Ford. We cannot go back for more years of Ford. Why isn't there some sort of like coalition magic going on between the other parties? Because, like, no, you guys don't see exactly eye to eye on every single issue, but it's a lot better than 4 more years of Ford.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a tough one. I've really tried to figure out ways to work across party lines, and with some parties it's easier to do that with than others. And I don't think I'm going to go much beyond that because I don't want it to sound too partisan. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways we can do things. And from my perspective, one of the things I've really tried to push on is that the 3 progressive opposition parties should have a commitment to voting reform election. And so, I've said this publicly, so I'll say it here is, ideally, I think I would like to see a minority government. I think some of the best governments in Canadian history have been minority governments. In particular, most recently, the BC NDP and the BC Greens had a party government that put forward at that time what was the best climate plan any province had put forward. And there's been some backtracking on that plan since it's no longer a minority government anymore. And so my hope is, I mean, we'll have to see. Obviously, the voters are going to make the decision. My hope is that it is a minority government and that is part of some sort of working collaboration. I don't really want to use the word coalition because there's a specific meaning to coalition. There are many ways parties can work together and not have a formal coalition. Supply and confidence agreement is one of them. And so my hope is if we're in a situation like that, that electoral reform be a really important part of that agreement. And I'm just really disappointed. I thought in 2015, when Prime Minister Trudeau really campaigned hard on electoral reform, that we were actually going to have it in Canada.
Broke my heart.
Yeah, it broke my heart too. Like, I was a part of a group here in Guelph called Democracy Guelph, where we brought people like conservatives, liberals, and Greens all together. We even had some conservatives all working to push for electoral reform after the 2015 election because we thought it was going to happen. And then when Mr. Trudeau backtracked on that promise, it was a major letdown. It was a huge opportunity that's lost.
Yeah, and he had a majority government. The whole thing sucked. The whole thing sucked so much. I cry about it all the time.
Yeah, me too.
Well, before we wrap up, I just want to thank you so much for being here today and listening and participating and sharing your perspective. I really, really appreciate that. Is there anything else you want our audience to know going into this election? I'll just hand it over to you.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's been a pleasure to be on. I've loved the conversations we've had today and in the past. And I would just say to all your listeners, get involved in this election campaign. You have an incredibly powerful voice, and young voters have a disproportionate impact. I mean, you're about 1/3 of or a quarter of the electorate. So you have a huge opportunity to really impact who gets elected in this election. And if I could just do one quick partisan pitch, I'd really encourage you about the Ontario Green Party's platform. We have, the Toronto Star, the headline yesterday was Mike Schreiner, the Greens declare war on poverty. I'm really excited about the bold policies we're putting forward to tackle poverty in this province. Our climate action plan, the lead authors, the former Environment Commissioner of Ontario, and it really is probably the first party platform that's put forward a detailed year-by-year, sector-by-sector analysis that shows how, with existing technology, we can do Ontario's part to crush climate pollution and do it in a way that helps address the affordability concerns people have and ensures that we have a prosperous economy with good jobs for people. And we also have some other great policies around protecting nature, making mental health services available through OHIP, and a whole host of other policies. So check it out and see if it's something that speaks to you, inspires you, because I can guarantee you a lot of young people played a very vital role in helping us write it.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And best of luck in the election. And yeah, let's collectively all just get rid of Ford, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.